Russia threatens the escalation of the UK and the United States. Ukraine can already receive permission to strike with long-range Western weapons on the territory of Russia. Today we are talking about the nuances of this decision with David Sharp, a military analyst from Israel. David, hello.
Albina, hello.
Today, Joe Biden is due to hold talks with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer on the possibility of allowing Ukraine to strike with Western long-range weapons on Russian territory. Putin, meanwhile, threatened war on both Britain and the United States. Now it looks like just a shaking of the air, or is the West still listening to these so-called statements?
Not that he threatened war, but hinted at not very good consequences, and by mentioning the word war, it is obvious that we are talking about various kinds of military actions and, possibly, sabotage and so on. Of course, if the West had absolutely not taken into account what Putin says and Russia's actions, then all permissions would have been given a long time ago, and unlimitedly and much further than what we are talking about today. The West takes these statements seriously, and I believe that the point is not even that the approach is erroneous or overly cautious. In the end, if you put yourself in the shoes of a hypothetical Western politician, it is clear that there is some meager risk of escalation with Russia, and therefore a meager risk of nuclear war. And a nuclear war, unlike any military clash, is a disaster. And in order to avoid disaster, they say, they are being careful. But over time, by removing these barriers that they themselves put up, these leaders, in general, sign off on this, and this happens over and over again. If we look in retrospect at the supply of weapons to Ukraine, at certain permits, as a result, the barriers are removed, but with a significant delay and nothing. And nothing serious or significant that was feared happens. This shows once again that these barriers, many of them were absolutely artificial, they could not have been put up in the first place. But, nevertheless, this approach has not gone anywhere. And, in my opinion, it is also a mistake that all these discussions around should make a decision or not make a decision. That is, even when it is already on the agenda, it has been discussed in the press for weeks, statements are made, and this gives Russia an additional chance to threaten once again. That is, they would have accepted, yes, secretly, not that they had gathered secretly, but they had thought it over at some stage, they decided that yes, it was necessary to give Ukraine some limited, and apparently we are talking about a limited permit, they gave it and without unnecessary discussions, leaks to the press and a week of exaggeration, this permission was even secretly transferred, without any statements. And then, in fact, a rocket will arrive, everyone will understand. Instead, they talk about it for weeks, Biden is inclined, Biden is not inclined, the British Prime Minister will go there. As a result, they give both Putin and Russia a new chance to scare the West again, including with public statements. Maybe they even give it to go a little backward. But what can we do? This is the policy and the strategy that the West adheres to, at least moving forward somehow, and this is already a plus.
Well, as for what you are saying, Biden has not made a decision. The New York Times writes that Biden may give the green light to the use of the Storm Shadow of British missiles, but there are still these hesitations about the ATACMS. And allegedly Biden should make a final decision after today's meeting. How important is it for Ukraine to get a decision on ATACMS? Maybe this decision, say, should be made about GLSDB? Maybe about some other nomenclature of missiles? Why is ATACMS important?
First of all, everything is important. Any additional features certainly matter. ATACMS, if we are talking about variations of even 160 kilometers in the cluster version and even more so 300 kilometers in the unitary version, these are serious bonuses for Ukraine in terms of accuracy and in terms of range, because in terms of range, Ukraine, of course, has its own resources in the form of drones. if we proceed from the fact that the ballistics is full-fledged and cruise missiles are only on the way for a few months before single copies appear on the battlefield, then the Ukrainians do not have the ability to hit targets at ranges of more than 70 to 80 kilometers, that is, we are now talking about HIMARS installations, to hit them accurately with large warheads, if we do not proceed from sabotage actions. Again, massive drone raids. ATACMS provides this opportunity. By the way, unlike Storm Shadow is an air-launched missile tied to air carriers. It has a special penetrating warhead. Therefore, when we talk about ATACMS, there is an opportunity to do without aircraft, which is very important. Because an aircraft is a preparation for departure, it is a risk of losing it. It is that it needs to attack the target without getting very close to Russian airspace. ATACMS gives an additional amount of ammunition for this range, a slightly different warhead and the ability to fire them from HIMARS installations, which in itself is very important. These installations run along the entire front line. Their readiness to fire, as far as I understand, is high in real time, so the ability to hit the most important targets on the territory of Russia at a depth of 200 kilometers. This is a very serious possibility. Here Russia will also face losses, serious, apparently, when opening fire with these ammunition. Or Russia will face not only losses, but also the need to transfer its important facilities, remove them from attack and cover them in any case. In other words, both require serious additional measures and difficulties, so all this is important. As for the GLSDB, as it turned out, this ammunition is very, very raw, such are the frustrations, very raw, unstable to countering electronic warfare. That is, apparently, it can be applied, or it should be improved, or applied where these countermeasures are not particularly included. And, of course, the range. This ammunition is 150 to 160 kilometers. And the classic ATACMS missile in the unitary version is 300 kilometers. But, as we can see from the story of Biden's hesitation, the Americans intend to act step by step. That is, the British will be given permission to give permission to Ukraine, according to the latest press reports, and with ATACMS they will wait for either some event with a minus sign again, and as a rule, this became triggers for permission for supplies and the removal of barriers. Whether it is strikes, God forbid, on Ukrainian cities, or, as was the case with the permission to use Western weapons, the seizure of part of the Kharkiv region, or, perhaps, before the elections, because in the Americans, of course, the main task of the current administration now, as they see it, this is not a task from my point of view, this is a task, as they set it for themselves, in no case to harm before the elections and not to make sudden movements. There is very little left before the elections.
At the same time, we see, you are talking about Ukrainian drones. We see that the Russian air defense, it does not really cope, judging by how many arrivals have been taking place in Russia lately. How do you assess the power of the Russian PPO in the rear, and if we have this permission, will the Russians have to transfer part of their PPO from the front there to close the rear?
То придется ли россиянам перебросить там часть их ППО с фронта, чтобы закрыть тыл?
As for the effectiveness of drone strikes, this, by the way, applies to strikes in any war and any country. The effectiveness of PPO can be discussed, let's say, by two parameters. Firstly, the main parameter, in fact, is whether it was possible to protect a certain target, or to prevent the breakthrough of air attack weapons into their territory. That is, the situation may be such, for example, that they are trying to protect a certain object and manage to shoot down 90% of the targets. But if the object was destroyed, is it possible, on the one hand, it seems that the air defense worked effectively, and on the other hand, can we say that it has fulfilled its task? Apparently not. Moreover, the attacking side, I am speaking very abstractly now, the attacking side knows that the enemy's air defense can act quite effectively and plans its attack, including based on the fact that there is a lot of ammunition. For example, the attack is carried out by drones, will be intercepted. But the task of the attacking side is to deliver such a number that even if 95% are intercepted, the remaining 5 will complete the task. Therefore, here the answer to how and when the air defense worked effectively can only be given knowing many circumstances. But if we see that some important object was hit, an example, a vivid example, if we are talking about Russia, for example, military airfields and cases when it was possible to destroy even planes or damage aircraft, or ammunition depots on the ground, at airfields, or another example, the destruction of oil refineries with the corresponding effects, oil depots. Obviously, the air defense did not cope completely. When drones reach Moscow, and, for example, they are shot down there already in the area of the Moscow region, then we can say that there is at least partially a problem. Obviously, the Russian command, ever thought about the defense of their country, I mean air defense, proceeded from the fact that enemy ammunition would reach Moscow, and if they decided to attack someone or some other object on the way to Moscow, then it turns out that that object would receive in full. In general, we can judge from the results, but nevertheless we do not know the figures, we do not know the percentage of interception, and we also do not know what tasks the Ukrainian command set. For example, if the task was to destroy 5 objects, and it was possible to destroy 1, and the task was at least 3, then it turns out that it seems that the Russians inflicted losses, but the minimum task was not completed. And, accordingly, Russia, most likely, coped with the minimum of its task. I am just giving some completely abstract examples to show how difficult it is sometimes to judge from the outside without having data. And vice versa, if 3 out of 5 targets are hit, then the task is at least more than completed and then the air defense failed. In general, in any case, Russia's air defense is not close to hermetic for objective and subjective reasons, and there is no reason to believe that something will change dramatically. But it would certainly be wrong to deny them that they are learning, that they are improving their tactics and capabilities. Regarding the use of ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles, hypothetical. Of course, if this permission is obtained, Russia will have to rethink something, because suddenly a very large number of objects, say, 200 plus kilometers, including very important ones, will be under attack. Here they will have to do, of course, not that they will have to, they can do nothing, but then the consequences can be fatal. Now, if they decide to do, and I guess we've already taken some measures beforehand. These measures will apparently include the evacuation of some kind of objects, for example, airfields or aircraft from airfields, and the strengthening of air defense cover for certain objects. And since the strengthening of air defense cover, this, according to the rule of Trishka's kaftan, means that these systems will be taken away from somewhere. And they will most likely take them from important areas too. And here there is already a certain gain for the Ukrainians, because if some objects in the front area or combat formations become less covered, then, of course, this can be used. And, of course, there are also such actions as crushing objects. Well, let's say, if we are talking about a warehouse, then one large warehouse can be scattered among 10 small ones, but this will add serious difficulties. You can try to urgently build some shelters that will protect some object, but this is already unlikely. Especially when we talk about Storm Shadow, about missiles with a penetrating warhead. In general, the consequences will be diverse. If they do not make efforts to protect the facilities that will be under attack, then they will face serious problems. And air defense, the transfer of air defense for protection, to protect these rear facilities, this is one of the options, apparently, the most obvious.
This is what you have already talked about. While there are these hesitations to give Ukraine, not to give Ukraine permission to strike with long-range weapons, to move its military facilities deep into Russia. In your opinion, how seriously does this affect Russian logistics, and does it affect the situation at the front in any way? I mean that military facilities, warehouses, airfields are moving further from the front line.
Let's start with airfields. This is the simplest situation. Suppose, in fact, from the airfields that will be in the affected area, they transfer combat aviation somewhere far away. Most likely, they are unlikely to have airfields, but maybe there are somewhere that are directly behind the line of conditional destruction. Apparently, they will have to be transferred even further. What difficulties do these create? First, it is necessary to create aircraft maintenance infrastructure at those airfields where it will be transferred, if it is not available. Because it is one thing to be the home airfield of the unit where it is based, and another thing to be somewhere else. That's the first thing. Secondly, of course, the flight range, the range of departures and the time spent in the air are increasing. These are certain inconveniences. Sometimes it is less time to stay on targets, or let's say, or a lower combat load, but also a greater waste of resources and a large waste of fuel, of course. But if we are talking about the fact that the planes were relocated only 100 or 2 kilometers ago, these factors that I am talking about, they are at work, each to some extent, but to say that this will directly lead to some kind of decisive or not decisive, but to super significant problems for Russian aviation, it would still be wrong. Problems are added, some unnecessary challenges are added, but this is not something cardinal. And if we had to relocate far back, so that it is literally impossible to take a load, or refueling in the air is necessary and so on, this would already be a very significant impact. So we can talk about partial influence. As for logistics, this, of course, needs to be looked at some specific objects. There is also the question of what they will be allowed to beat, because, as we hear, if they are allowed, then it seems to be a limited list. Perhaps some objects, most likely related to the fuel and energy complex, will be out of the game in this regard. And, accordingly, maybe Russia, of course, should worry about them all the same, but what if they give permission? And what if the Ukrainians violate the ban? Who knows? But in any case, all kinds of nuances are important here. Logistics, if some large warehouses or hubs, logistics hubs will have to be thrown back. If warehouses are scattered, crushed, what I said, yes, this complicates logistics. As a result, what problem can there be in logistics, or more effort to implement these logistics chains? What does more effort mean? More cars, more human resources, that is, spending. A lot rests, in the end, on spending. So, if you have to incur large expenses, this is a minus. If you have to drive longer and drive less, theoretically, due to the long distance, this is also a certain disadvantage. But in the end, everything rests, in logistics, everything rests on certain norms and quantities that units in the area of the front line or not only the front line receive. If in a certain period of time Russian military units receive their norm as much as before, then their actions will not suffer in any way by and large. If at the same time, in order to ensure this very norm, Russia goes to great costs and great efforts, then yes, here is a certain minus. As a result, how important all these things are, it will be possible to understand, roughly speaking, you need to calculate in monetary terms. If this effort is an additional expenditure of tens of millions of dollars or hundreds a month, hundreds is already a lot, then yes, this is a serious factor. And if not very, then not very much. And on the other hand, combat operations and the success of combat operations are made up of a lot of components. If you have created at least some minus for the enemy, and at least some advantage for yourself, this is already beneficial.
Again, the permission to strike deep into the territory of Russia does have a number of nuances, those that you voiced, those that Volodymyr Zelenskyy voiced the day before. There is a limitation of mileage, and the ability to hit with the specific weapon that we were given, and so on. What do you think about this policy of non-escalation? Is this still a policy of non-escalation of the West and a purely political decision? Or is it some kind of strategy of the West, as they do not see help in this war for Ukraine?
I am not a supporter of the approach according to which the West gives certain restrictions so that Ukraine does not succeed on the battlefield. This is, of course, a political decision, but it is part of a cautious, super cautious strategy that we have repeatedly talked about. Fear of escalation with Russia. The word fear may not be very beautiful and not very good. It does not sound very politically correct. Let's talk about significant fears. In my opinion, the fears are excessive, related to the fact that first of all, Russia is a nuclear power, with which even stronger nuclear powers, such as the United States, much stronger, and in terms of nuclear potential, still do not want to deal, do not want to risk even a little. There, too, the Americans and the leaders of other Western countries are well aware that despite Russia's vocal threats, not to mention Medvedev's tweets and so on, Russia is actually even more, if they have not lost a minimum of common sense, even more than the Americans should fear a clash with NATO in all respects. Conventional, because Russia is much weaker in principle, and is also bogged down in Ukraine so that the borders are bare, and the last reserves in the form of criminals and anyone else are rushing to the front. This is conventional. And unconventional, of course, they also understand there, I assure you, that Russia does not have an advantage in non-conventional weapons. But Russia is taking full advantage of the "Hold Me 7" approach, which can also be called more intelligently nuclear blackmail. The current administration's strategy is to be as cautious as possible. Each time, retroactively, they abandon certain self-restrictions, in fact showing that their own caution is excessive. Now we are right in the process of this very next partial refusal. The British will be allowed, they will wait, a list of targets. What can I say? But this is dictated, in my understanding, by nothing more than the fear of escalation and some conspiracy theories or intrigues of such an extremely negative understanding of this word. In my opinion, there is no need to look for a negative effect. Nevertheless, such an over-cautious policy has a negative impact. There is no doubt about it.
Speaking about the policy of non-escalation, including in connection with the fact that Russian drones are flying further and further, and they violate the airspace, now of the Baltic countries, Poland, Romania, and so far, for fun, it is worth saying that only Lukashenko shot down drones on his territory. What do you think? Yes, please.
The situation, of course, would be partially funny if it were not sad in some moments. The fact that, by the way, Lukashenko shot down or tried to shoot down, I don't know how successfully, it's not surprising. When a drone that has lost control with explosives, and even without explosives, circles on your territory, it is desirable that it does not fall on a settlement or on something important. As for the Western fronts, the situation is twofold. In fact, there is this element of reluctance to escalate. That is, no one wants to intercept a drone directly over Ukrainian territory, or over the ribbon itself, as they say. Suddenly it turns out that it will fall over Ukrainian territory, then it will be a kind of interference in the course of hostilities. But over his own territory, as they say, God himself commanded. True, there are some buts. I don't think that when a drone flies into the territory of country X, any of them can be named from your list. I don't think that there is already any element of fear of escalation here. To shoot down a drone 5 kilometers above your territory, especially 25 kilometers above your territory, this will no longer be a manifestation. Even with the most cautious policy, it will not be even close to a manifestation of some, let's call it, aggression towards Russia. But here they still have fears to act at the very borders, and then, as I see it, all sorts of technical, legislative issues come into play. First of all, and I am trying to be the devil's advocate now, because my approach would be to try, including for the sake of training, and in order to avoid some consequences, to shoot down planes, to shoot down drones that penetrate our own airspace as a matter of priority. And even to take important measures, serious efforts for this. But they need to understand that there is still civil aviation, and some kind of sports and agricultural aviation flying somewhere. And therefore we need some solutions that will allow us to avoid risk for the sake of covering, as they say, the fifth point. Finally, there are purely operational opportunities. After all, they are well aware, at least that until now, Either Russia is trying them out, sometimes launching a drone to check the reaction, or these are accidental flights. And they understand that they are not the goal. And therefore, to keep the means along the border, to keep 24/7, serious expensive means, for example, F-16 aircraft, fighters must be in full readiness 24 hours, 7 days a week, with pilots almost in the cockpit, and preferably transferred to the border area, so as to take off and immediately catch up with the enemy's drone and somehow hit it. I'm talking about the technical component now. If there is no such approach, then a lot needs to be changed. Anti-aircraft missile systems. This does not mean, as far as I believe, that anti-aircraft missile systems are deployed along the Polish border, which, again, are waiting in the wings 24/7 in combat readiness. Most likely, or I will assume that there is nothing of the kind. To switch to such a regime, you also need to go to various costs and measures. Again, peaceful life goes on at this time. A drone flew in, that's how I express myself as devil's advocate. He accidentally flew in, and fell somewhere. Actually, these are the approaches. That is, there is a legislative moment, purely military technical, the same fear of escalation. But what can I tell you? I will give you an example of the Iranian attack on Israel in April of this year, when the attack was of a combined nature, cruise missiles, drones and ballistic missiles. Ballistic missiles were almost all exclusively assumed by Israel, and cruise missiles and drones flew through Iraq and through Jordanian territory towards Israel. And here all the participants, so to speak, are direct and indirect. These are Israel, the Americans, the British, the French and the Jordanians, in addition to the fact that it was important from a political point of view, strategic for various reasons, to help Israel in intercepting drones and cruise missiles, and they still really wanted to train. Here is the opportunity, forward, as they say, and even the French, a few French and a few British aircraft, on which little depended and nothing much was needed. And the Jordanians themselves, all with joy, including from the point of view of checking their military in the case, how they cope with such a threat, took a very active part. So my personal approach would be somewhat different if I were in a country that faces this kind of challenge. The approach would be to look for interception opportunities, and in fact there would be no escalation from this, but these interception capabilities are associated with the use of various kinds of measures, and these measures cost money and cost some effort.
49 Ukrainians have returned home from Russian captivity today, and 49 have also left the Russian occupiers for Russia. We see that prisoner exchanges have become more frequent recently, compared to 6 months ago. What do you think? Recently, there was a month of the Kursk operation. Certain results were summed up. If we do not take into account the goals and some tasks of the Ukrainian military political leadership. As a military analyst, how do you assess this operation and what are your forecasts for the Kursk region?
Predictions. The first stage of the operation was the offensive itself, taking into account how high a degree of operational and tactical surprise was achieved. The operation can be regarded as very successful. A breakthrough was made, the actual defeat of the Russian line of defense, and the significant territory was occupied. Naturally, this had a huge moral effect and a political effect, and so on. But then, at this local stage, everything, except, perhaps, for some individual attacks, where they went too far, got into an ambush and so on, here everything was globally successful, but the chickens are counted in the fall, in many cases and here, of course, and here is the moment when the Ukrainian command of the leadership did not decide. The fact that we have carried out this large raid and are quickly withdrawing forces, which means that a different kind of goals are being set, and the goals may be a long-term retention of territory. By the way, I am not sure, despite the fact that this has been announced, I am not sure that this is so. Perhaps they are still going to divert their strength and leave quickly enough. We will see this in the course of events. But at the moment when other far-reaching goals are already being set, it is simply too early to draw conclusions. As we understand, it was not possible to divert the direction of the Russian army from Pokrovsk. I don't know if there was such a plan. There was probably hope for this. But if they were sure of this, by the way, we are talking about goals when we talked about air defense, how successful the activities of the attackers and defenders are. Here is also an interesting point. If the Ukrainian leadership set as its goal, I emphasize, not hope, but the goal that we would attack and the Russians would withdraw forces from Pokrovsk, then it was a miscalculation. It is very obvious that this calculation was erroneous. You can hope, you expect, this is that there will be a minimum task. The minimum task is that forces have been removed from some other secondary areas. Therefore, I think that there was this kind of hope, but it was not a minimum task, because it did not depend on the Ukrainians, whether they would be removed from the Pokrovsky direction or not. If the Ukrainian offensive operation had been much more profound, created a strategic danger for Russia, then it is likely that Russia would have been left with a hopeless situation, forced to withdraw troops from the Pokrovsky direction. Today, they had a choice, and they chose. We see what choice they made. So a lot will depend on the further course of events, what efforts will be made in the Ukrainians if they decide to hold the territory, what reserves will be transferred for this, how this will affect other sectors of the front, what forces will be transferred from where, the Russians will continue to transfer, the success of this operation, if it continues. Therefore, some intermediate stages can be assessed as successful, if we take it without linking with other directions, but as for other directions, it is obvious that near Pokrovsk and other places, the forces that are involved near Kursk would obviously be useful and would bring some effect, but the Ukrainian command and authorities acted consciously. It was not a spontaneous decision. They calculated the situation for a long time, apparently understood those problems, that is, roughly speaking, they sacrificed the figure, as they say, for the sake of some achievements. I would like to hope that they calculated correctly, but as I have already said, at the moment it is too early to draw final conclusions regarding purely military operations at the micro level. This initial stage is the main one, and the operations in the Kursk region, of course, look successful.
David, thank you very much for your analytics, for taking the time to join our stream. David Sharp, a military analyst from Israel, was a guest on this stream.